Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this very special Sundays at Home program in conversation with author Tiya Miles, and happy Women's History Month. Throughout the month of March, the National Women's History Museum is paying tribute to the women on whose shoulders we stand, celebrating inspiring women's stories and encouraging all women to share and remember their own. Author, diplomat, and trained mediator Shireen Dodson states that, quote, "If we want our girls to benefit from the courage and wisdom of the women before them, we have to share the stories," end quote. In that spirit, today's program takes a closer look at how women's stories and legacies are passed down from generation to generation to instruct, to uplift, and to inspire resiliency. My name is Lori Ann Turgison. I serve as the Vice President of Education at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended an NWHM program before, welcome back, and thank you for your continued support. This special Women's History Month NWHM Sundays at Home programming is co-presented with DC Public Library and with generous underwriting support from Time Warner Media. Before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for a limited time on the museum's dedicated YouTube channel and days following the event. Today's guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the chat feature for any comments that you have during the program, and use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you may have regarding the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Thank you to those of you who submitted your questions in advance as well. I'm joined today by two very special guests, Dr. Tiya Miles, author of All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family Keepsake, and Dr. Martha S. Jones, who will guide this afternoon's conversation. Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the NSF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Dr. Jones is the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, selected as one of Time's 100 most read books for 2020. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award, the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize, the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. She's also author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture, 1830 to 1900, and a co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, together with many articles and essays. Dr. Jones is a public historian, writing for broader audiences at the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, USA Today, Public Books, Talking Points Memo, Politico, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Time. She is the exhibition curator for Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library, and an expert consultant for museum, film, and video productions at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Netflix. Dr. Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia University and a JD from the Cooney School of Law. We're grateful to have Martha with us today to moderate our conversation. And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest author this afternoon, Dr. Tiya Miles. Dr. Miles is originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, but currently lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with her husband and 3 children. She received her AB in Afro-American Studies from Harvard University in 1992, her MA in Women's Studies from Emory University in 1995, and her PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota in 2000. She taught in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, before moving to the University of Michigan in 2002. She taught on the faculty of the University of Michigan for 16 years as a professor in American culture, history, Afro-American and African studies, Native American studies, and women's studies. She's the former chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and a former director of Native American Studies. Dr. Miles is currently a professor of history and Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard University. Her research and creative interests include African American, Native American, and American women's histories, literatures, and lives, as well as public history, public humanities, and environmental humanities. Since 2005 and Hurricane Katrina, she has been very concerned about environmental issues and climate change. As a result, Dr. Miles developed an environmental education and girls' self-esteem building project called Eco Girls. That's the environmental and cultural opportunities for girls in urban Southeast Michigan. She's also the recipient of a Mellon Foundation New Directions Fellowship, which she used to study environmental history at Montana State University in 2014 to 15 to complete 2 books, The Cherokee Rose and Tales from the Haunted South. Her first book, Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, received 4 awards from Historical Humanities, American Studies, and Native American Studies associations, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians for the best first book in American history, and recognition from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association as one of the 10 most influential books of the first decade of the 21st century. She's also the author of The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story, which was awarded 3 historical book prizes, including the Best Book Award from the National Council on Public History. She is the co-editor of Crossing Waters, Crossing Worlds, the African Diaspora in Indian Country, and has published various personal essays on race, feminism, and identity, as well as academic articles on women's history and Black and Native interrelated experience. In 2011, she became the grateful recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. Dr. Miles writes both history and works of fiction. As a public historian, she's discovered and written down many stories from the past and states that, quote, "When I write history, I'm making an unspoken promise to my readers that I will relate what I know about the past and what I can reasonably interpret as truthfully and accurately as possible," end quote. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiya Miles and Dr. Martha Jones to the screen.
Hi, Lorianne. Thank you so much for welcoming us, for the introductions, and I'm going to take it from here. And I'm thrilled to be here and in conversation with Tiya Miles. I guess the first thing to say to Tiya is congratulations on the extraordinary success of this book. I know it must be incredibly gratifying to have to imagine all the readers who are picking up this story and making themselves a part of it. It's wonderful for us at the National Women's History Museum to have you with us, especially for Women's History Month. Our conversation gave me a chance to reread all that she carried. I had read it. It actually had been what I listened to in my car, so I've enjoyed the audiobook. And I say that as an appreciation, but also just to remind folks who are tuning in that we will get to talk about a few aspects of this book, but get the book, borrow it, buy it, listen to it, read it. It is really an important and moving and deeply worthwhile undertaking. Last thing I'm going to say by way of introduction is just I want to warn this audience that this is a conversation between 2 old colleagues and friends. So we're going to invite you to listen in on our conversation about this book. This is the first chance we've had to talk about all that she carried, and I'm really honored, Tiya, for the chance to be with you. So welcome.
Thank you, Martha. I'm so touched by that. And Lorianne, thank you for your introduction of both Martha and me. That was very warm and very generous. And everyone who's here, hello. Thanks for being here. We've been reading the chat. We're so happy that you're here. And thank you for reading my book, for reading Martha's book, for trying to get the books from your public libraries. Thanks for waiting in those queues. We're grateful to you for doing that, letting libraries know that there are lots of readers out there who want to hear women's stories and want to hear Black women's stories. And Martha, thank you for the congratulations. And I agree with you. The audiobook is wonderful. Janetta Edwards has the most beautiful, moving, compelling voice, and I was really happy and honored to have the chance to to ask her to do this. And you actually read part of this book a long time ago, as you will remember. You were very helpful for me. So you don't remember reading?
A little, yeah.
Okay. Well, everybody, Martha Jones read a chapter of this book years ago and gave me really important feedback, really pushing me to think about what it was that I was saying about Black feminist theorizing. And she was asking me to fine-tune my own thinking and my own voice. And that made a huge difference, Martha, in terms of how I situated this book. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very generous of you, but it's also an honor. But the book that this became is something very different, I think, from where you began. And maybe that is a place to dive in, because one of the things that's remarkable about this book is that you could say, I think it's actually 3 books, sort of interwoven with one another. On the one hand, it is the story of this simple cotton sack, once filled, now empty, how it traveled from a mother, Rose, to a daughter, Ashley, all the way to the 20th century, to a descendant, Ruth Middleton in Philadelphia, finally to Charleston and Middleton Place, a one-time slaveholding plantation, and now a remarkable historic site. There is that story about this sack and that family and the legacies. There's another story, I think, one that in which you masterfully synthesize the extraordinary literature on African-American women's history. You know, I think I say it, and I imagine you do too, right? Standing on the shoulders of your own work, but so much of the work that comes before us, that we learn so much about African-American women's history, how they lived enslaved, how they survived, how some of us thrived through the brutal ordeal of enslavement. And here, I think, this is the story, I think, about many things, including love. And the last is your story, the historian, her quest, the detective work, the search for the meaning of the sack and not just the fact of the sack. And you really allow us to get under the hood and understand how we do history. So my question is really, what came first? And how did you decide to tackle and interweave these 3 stories? Because I imagine there was a point where there was a much simpler story you might have decided to tell.
Well, I appreciate that question, and also your perceptive reading and your articulation of the various stories that I ended up trying to interweave through all that she carried. What came first, Martha, was a feeling. What came first was emotion. I was not planning to write this book at all. I had a plan for what would come next. I had actually just published a book about slavery in Detroit, about Black and Indigenous enslavement. And before that, I had done work on the Southeast, on the Native American Southeast, and slavery in the Cherokee Nation. And I was slowly plotting a course westward. So I had written a book about Michigan and the Great Lakes and the Midwest, and my next book was going to be about Montana. I was going to write about Buffalo soldiers, especially their wives and families, just think about those interactions in the Rockies and on the Northern Plains. This book on Ashley Sack took me by complete surprise. And when I saw the sack, I felt an overwhelming sense of awe, loss, sadness, beauty. And I couldn't turn away from it. I wanted to write about it. I wanted to try to find a way to see these women whose names are on the sack, whose names are inscribed on the sack in the past, in their lives. I wanted to find a way to honor them and to bring them forward into our own time and to open up the experiences they must have had in a way that would respect them and also enrich us. This was all sort of a sense of emotional calling. It was actually the steps afterward when I began to think about, okay, maybe some facts need to enter into this process. Maybe I need to get down onto the ground and begin some of the research. And as I started doing that, and I realized that there was going to be a massive barrier to documenting their stories, I then opened up my sources and opened up my thinking into a number of different arenas, including this whole broad swath of Black women's history that you mentioned, also women's histories with textiles and environmental histories and landscape histories of Charleston, South Carolina, urban histories of Philadelphia. All of that came after I knew that I had to tell the story from starting with this place in the heart.
Let me ask you about the sack, because I do remember you telling me about your encounter with the sack. I think I'm right, at the Smithsonian in Washington, where it resided for a time. My recollection of it, even in your early telling, was, it is produced at one of the most, the most feared, the most traumatic moments in the lives of enslaved people, the impending separation of a family, classically at an auction block, but through private sale, the division of estates and more. And there, we begin to see, at least as the outlines of Rose and Ashley, in that unspeakable moment, a mother passes the sack to the daughter, 3 hands full of a tattered dress, a braid of hair, and love.
Right.
But boy, that does feel like, a powerful, but fragmentary way to begin a book. How do you know when it's a book?
That's the question, right, Martha?
That
is the question. What I'd like to do before I answer that is add a few more words to what you just said, to be sure that people who are on the call, who are in the Zoom space, have more of the context of the sack that we're talking about. Martha pointed out that I first saw the sack that we're discussing at the Smithsonian in DC. And that's when I first saw it in person. It was one of the artifacts that was displayed upon the opening of the National African American Museum. The sack, as we see it now in our time, in our moment, is an old, large, discolored agricultural sack. It would have been used for carrying grain or seeds in the mid-19th century. And the sack is inscribed with sentences that are embroidered in thread. The sentences tell the story of the family that Martha was just speaking of a mother named Rose, who, according to the story that is sewn onto the sack, gave the sack itself to her daughter, whose name was Ashley, when Ashley was 9 years old. And the sack says that Rose packed this bag with specific items and that she gave it to Ashley on the eve of their separation, as Ashley was being sold away into unknown parts during the period of enslavement. And the sack tells us that Rose and Ashley never saw each other again after their separation. And the sack is signed by a descendant, by a granddaughter and a great-granddaughter of Ashley and Rose, whose name is Ruth Middleton. She signs her name, Ruth Middleton. She signs the date 1921. And the items in the sack are just as Martha has summarized them. There was a dress that was packed, 3 handfuls of pecans were packed, Rose packed a braid of her own hair, and Ruth Middleton sews onto the sack that Rose packed, quote, "my love always." So Rose packed love into this bag, gave it to Ashley, and tried to ensure that her daughter would have the things she would need to survive in their separation. So this is what we have. This is what we are starting with. It's a bag. It's a very plain looking bag, except for the fact of the sewn embroidered inscription. The lines are multicolored. They're in different colors. The line about Rose packing her love is in red. The word love is large and centered on the sack. And the name Ashley Sack was attached to the bag by curators at the Middleton Place Plantation, which is the current legal owner of the sack. Because of course, Ashley is the daughter who received the bag from her mother, Rose. So Martha asked, how do you know you have a book? And that was a difficult question and a key question that I faced early on after seeing the sack. And I saw it and I felt, oh my goodness, I have to write about this. I have to think about this. I have to come closer to this object, this artifact, which is like nothing I've ever seen before. And I determined to do some initial research and went down to Middleton Place and talked with curators there. I read articles that were already published about the sack by an anthropologist named Mark Auslander. I read descriptions of the sack in works by historians Heather Williams and others. And I began to do a little bit of poking around in the archives in South Carolina to see what was there. I also talked with curators at the Smithsonian, asking them if they thought there was a room for a book like this, because I really wanted the story to be told, but if somebody else was already telling it, I would have stepped back and tried to support them in doing that. But I was encouraged by everyone I asked to tell the story and to lend my particular voice to the interpretation of the sack. And I tried to see what I could find. And Martha and everybody on this call, there was not very much. What I found was very disappointing. And I'd say that I gave this early process maybe 6 months to try to determine, how could the story be told? Could it be told in book form? Should it be told in essay form, article form? There really wasn't much. And I feared that I wasn't going to be able to identify who Rose actually was, a particular woman named Rose who lived in South Carolina in the 19th century. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to determine who Ashley was or to verify anything on the sack. And without that kind of corroborating evidence, it's difficult to write a book. It's certainly difficult to write a history. A person could imagine writing a novel based on sparse evidence, but writing a history is another kind of endeavor. And so I wrestled with it, Martha, and I determined at around that 6-month mark that there wasn't going to be the kind of evidence that I had really wanted when I started the research. There wasn't going to be the kind of evidence that I felt that I needed as a scholar to tell the story. But by then, I was so deeply into the sack, emotionally and conceptually, that I decided I wasn't going to let it go. I was going to try to write a book, come heck or high water, and that I would just have to push myself to try to find out how to do it. And I will add, especially because, Martha, you and I have many times talked about the emotional aspects of the work we do and some of the things that we as Black women scholars feel that we keep to ourselves and that we protect from a public view. But I will say that I was really afraid to try to write this book. I worried about writing a book, publishing a book for which there was so scanty a source base at first glance. I will add that at first glance. And I worried about what it would mean to try to use alternative methods for writing the history, which were going to be required. So even though I was committed emotionally, kind of mentally, psychologically, I was quite anxious about taking on a project like this. It felt like a risk.
That's really helpful because part of what I was thinking about as I reread the book was a report that the American Association for State and Local Historians recently released called Reframing History. And part of what they tell us, what they learned in their research was that in some sense, this is exactly what readers want to know, right? It is not only your conclusions, but how you got to those conclusions. And I think, so the opening up that you describe, and I think the vulnerability you describe is partly exposing the process, which is kind of uneven and messy and includes disappointments and dead ends. But I think this is precisely, I think, one of the reasons readers are coming to the book and coming back to the book, because you show that rather than covering that up or leaving that only to footnotes, which is oftentimes where we kind of hide, I don't know, the messy stuff. So I want to ask you a little bit more about the African American women's history that really buoys the story of Ashley and Rose and the destiny of the sack. And you alluded to this. And I think maybe some folks who are tuned in today have heard this, that we can't write, or it's too difficult to try and write African American women's history, particularly enslaved women's histories, particularly histories that explore their interior lives, their affective lives. But I read this book as really insisting that there was a way to get to what you ultimately tell us is love. So tell me, I guess, about that, sort of how you get to love. And maybe it's there all along, right, in the stitching, but how you get there as a thinker, as a researcher to love. And with that, I think how you come to be comfortable, I think as you always have, importantly in your work, comfortable with the perhaps and with the likely and the thoughtful speculation, the reaching for less expected kinds of sources, because you help us to become ultimately, I think, comfortable with that.
When I realized that I wouldn't have the kind of solid paper trail that I needed to identify Rose and Ashley in a way that was sure, I started to think about what are the nearest sources that I could turn to help me to understand their lives. And those nearest sources were, as best as I could determine, the narratives of Black women who had been enslaved, as well as letters dictated by or written by Black women who had been enslaved. And as I went back to some narratives that I had read in graduate school, even in college, earlier in my career, and looked at these letters that I just mentioned, I saw parallels between what Black women were writing in telling their own stories and what they were writing, or what, excuse me, Ruth Middleton had inscribed on the sack. And that is a deep and abiding conviction that close relationships and that the family were central to what was important in life. So Harriet Jacobs' narrative is one that I turn to. I've always turned to her narrative in all of my books. But I turned to it again and looked at it more closely when trying to think about the sack. And of course, at the center of her narrative is her struggle as a mother and her wrestling with what it meant to give birth to children who were property and who she couldn't protect, but who she deeply, deeply loved. And Jacob struggled with this. She struggled with how her babies, her son and her daughter, were so much a part of her, such a tie to life for her. And yet they were people who she at the same time sometimes wished that she hadn't birthed because of the atrocities that she imagined they would face, the atrocities that she had had to face. This sense of love and family and maternity and thoughts for the future, the sense of Black women's worlds, which I was seeing when I revisited these narratives, exactly paralleled what I saw on the sack. And so what I felt was that I had a chorus of voices saying much the same thing as Ruth Middleton had been saying on the sack about the four mothers in her family. And that's what helped to anchor me around this theme of love. I will say that even though I answered your first question by talking about how I came to this project via emotion, that I really went round and around the bend with myself about how to approach this book. Because even though I felt summoned by the intensity of the emotion with regard to the sack, I didn't feel comfortable with writing a book about love. I felt that not only did love seem to be an overused term in our culture, almost a hollowed out term in our culture, but also that as a scholar, and as a Black woman scholar, if I wrote a book about love, it would be like saying nothing. It would be like giving expression to an idea that had no weight. Because scholars are expected to be objective, something that we wrestle with, right? The question of what does objectivity even mean and should we strive for it? And Black women are already stereotyped as being overly emotional and not intellectual. And so I hesitated, Martha, to actually write the book that was staring me in the face the first time I saw the sack, which is a book about love, family, emotion, connection, togetherness, belonging, kinship, family, all those things, right? I thought, oh no, I'm gonna have to find a smarter idea and a better idea and a stronger argument, an original argument, right, as we're called to do in the historical field. And I wrestled with that for a long time. Reading these narratives, rereading these narratives, reading these letters with Black women talking about their children, their husbands, their parents that they were being severed from, and hearing that rhythmic call to love and for love in their writing over and over and over again gave me permission. That's actually not the right way to phrase it. It compelled me to uplift this theme of love as the major argument of the book, regardless of whether or not it was going to be viewed in a stereotypical way or viewed as being lightweight because here's another woman writing about love.
And then you go in like 1,000%. And as someone who has followed your work for a long time now, there's a moment early in this book that I thought was a departure, because part of what you turn to is your own family. And I want to ask you about that. Your grandmother, your great aunt Margaret, a quilt. How is, talk about vulnerability, right? Talk about being exposed, talking about putting it all out there. What did it mean to include your own family stories and fold them into this kind of long narrative about Black women and love?
I'm so glad you asked me that, Martha, because I will answer the question, and then I'm going to turn it around and ask you the very same question. My personal family story was not a part of this book. In many of the first drafts, this book went through several drafts. It's the hardest book I've ever written. It's a book that I've rewritten the most times. I think I wrote 7 drafts of this book. It was such a challenge, and it took such a long time to find this final form. You're right, Martha, when you said that the finished book feels like it has evolved since you read an early chapter. It has. It's gone through many iterations. I tried to find the way to tell it a way that would be right and respectful, and that would open the story up to as many readers as possible, because I think that the story is so important for our own time. So my family was not in it for the first drafts, but I was encouraged to include my family story at an event where I presented the work at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. And the reactions that I received, especially from the fellows at the Hutchins Center, were all focused on the personal piece, the spiritual piece, the spirituality aspect, which runs quietly through the book. And they wanted to know about my own family. And I was thinking, this is about my family. But that's what they were asking about. And they pushed me and encouraged me to put myself into the book and to open up space for the spiritual history, the religious history that was an undercurrent in the book. And I did that partly because they suggested it, they asked for it. It's what they, as Black Studies scholars, were gravitating toward in the book. And also, I had received an NEH grant for this research, National Endowment for the Humanities grant for this research. And that grant was a Public Scholars Award, which is given to support projects and scholarship that is making a strong effort to bridge the divide that we often experience and that we often see between scholarly and academic writing and publishing and multiple public audiences who want to engage with this material, but often feel like it's inaccessible, or it's too distant, or it's too dense, or it's written in a language or jargon that they aren't privy to. And so that was another aspect that was leading me to think that bringing my own family story in could be a positive addition to the manuscript, because everybody has some notion of family. Everyone has family, whether or not they are still living with or close to their natal family. We all know what family is. Many of us make and create our own families, which consists of people who, of course, aren't just blood kin, but are adoptive kin. They're the kin that we make. We all live within and through family. So it was a way that I could potentially open up this 19th century story to audiences right now. And so I did that. And it was another step that to me felt risky, because I was exposing not only my own emotions and feelings about the SAC, which kind of come through the book in places, but also my own feelings about my family. I was telling stories about my grandmother, a person who, she just means the world to me. She just means the world to me. She made me who I am. I love her so much. I just love her so much. And I was revealing things about her and about our relationship that were, private. And I was also revealing things about my family that I didn't know how my aunts or my cousins were going to feel about it because, Martha, between you and me and everybody on this call, I was the person who inherited the quilt that my great aunt Margaret made, that my grandmother had inherited before me. And let me just say that that quilt is a prized possession among many women in our family. And so for me to be writing about this quilt and the family story attached to it, and for me to be mentioning that I am the current caretaker of this quilt, could have ruffled some family feathers. And I was worried about that too. But I'm very glad that I wrote about my grandmother. I'm glad that I think captured some sense of her on the page. I'm glad more people maybe will have a sense to know a bit about her, because she was one of these Black women who the world would say was nobody special. The world would say that, Martha, that she was nobody special. I mean, she was descended from enslaved people whose names nobody will ever know. They were just regular enslaved people working in the cotton fields of Mississippi. She was a domestic worker her whole life, all the way, through the time that she was in her late 70s. And that was the only career that I knew her to be engaged in. And she struggled her whole life with poverty and with domestic abuse, and to take care of her children, to love her children, to put her children through school. She didn't have a paper trail. She only went through the 5th grade. The letters that she wrote to me were letters that looked like they were written by a 5th grader. But of course, with the depth, intellectualism, the meaning, the understanding, the wisdom of people who had lived for centuries, because my grandmother was brilliant. But she was one of these people who never know about. And as I thought about her and wrote about her for this book, I made the connection that so was Rose. So was Ashley. These were just, regular Black women. They didn't get a chance to learn how to read and write while enslaved. They didn't run away, and they weren't celebrated by abolitionists. They didn't have a certain kind of privilege of mixed raceness, or even though it comes with a history of violence and pain, they didn't have white family members to lean on who might help them to navigate. And this was my grandmother, and this was her family story. And so I felt those stories coming together. And in the end, I think that telling that little bit of my own family story, I should say, I hope that enriched the whole. So Martha, I know you want to ask me another question, but I actually would like to ask you if you would please tell me and tell us about your experience. I know you're writing about your grandmother and your family, and I'm really, really eager for that book to be written and to come out into the world.
Well, I mean, I think I share, your sense that when I put myself on the page, which I did a little bit in my last book, a little bit like you, like right at the beginning, right? But then I sort of fall out and it becomes much more about history. But now writing a book that is very self-consciously about my own family, partly I am trying to push on us as historians to recognize, right, the many kinds of folk who are historical subjects, right, who make up the past, who are the engines of change in all kinds of ways. And so I think partly for me, it's been about hoping that I open up some space for readers, right, to see their own families, their own family artifacts in your story, right? I don't have a sack, right, but I have a handkerchief, right, which says a lot about class and a lot of other things, right? But I have a lace handkerchief, right, that is down to me. And I think that to think about those as the artifacts of history is still new, right, for academic historians is still a revelation, I think, for readers of history, right? That our families, our stories, our artifacts, our keepsakes. So for me, putting myself in has been a way of opening up that space, I think, a little more broadly than maybe it has been. And still, I think that it's a process, right? You know, which is just, you know, a shorthand way of saying that as we peel away the layers in our own families. I mean, I read your family story, and then I'll stop with my digression, but I read your part about your grandmother, about your Aunt Margaret, and honestly, I had I almost had envy because it was such a beautiful story and it was so full of love. And I thought, I'm over here writing my family history, and as I peel away the layers, it gets troubled and it's not beautiful always. It isn't always. There's love, but there's a lot more kind of running through their lives and as a consequence through my life. So so it's definitely a challenge. And maybe I can use that to segue because I did want to come back to the SAC. You know, you do a beautiful job of what I would call like meditating on all of the objects that Ruth tells us were in that sack when Rose passes it to Ashley, the pecans, the dress. But I want to ask about the braid of hair. And I know you know I was going to ask you about this because I am really interested to know sort of how you came to understand the meaning of a braid of hair. I think there are probably a lot of people on this call who have encountered, you know, a lock of hair, a braid, maybe tucked in an envelope or in the pages of a book or even in a locket. But to me, of all the things that were in the sack, I guess the love is the most mysterious of all. But of the material objects, the braid is the most complicated. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about where you landed on helping us understand the meaning of passing on a braid of hair.
The first organization that I put to telling the story of Rose, Ashley, and Ruth and the sack was one in which I was going to dedicate a chapter to every item in the sack. So a chapter on the dress and dresses for Black enslaved women, a chapter on pecans, a chapter on the braid of Rose's hair, a chapter on love, and a chapter on the sack itself. The sack itself as a material object. I think I had about 3 drafts in that format, and I appreciated that format because it allowed me to take deep dives into material, culture, history, and try to think about what these things would have meant in their own time to the people who had used them and what they might mean for us today. I ended up moving away from that structure because I felt that it wasn't allowing me to get close enough to the women themselves. Even though I really wanted to investigate and explore and meditate on those objects, I didn't want this to be kind of solely an object history, or even, let me say, centrally an object history. It is an object history in that it is about a sack, but it is much more history about relationships and women's relationships. But I did do a lot of thinking about the braid and about hair, and some of that remains in the book. In the chapter where I think about and write about Rose's act of packing, and I try to imagine and to contextualize how it could have been that she would even have gotten a hold of these items, under what circumstances and where on the grounds of the Charleston Manor House where she was enslaved would she have packed the sack? How might she have actually physically given the sack to Ashley? In what order might she have placed the items? How might the items have rubbed off on the sack, and so on. And in that chapter, I think about hair in a number of different ways. One of those ways is the meaning of hair to African-American women really across time. The emphasis is on the period of enslavement, the period when Rose was living, mid-19th century, 1840s, 50s. But that history, I think, has borne a legacy that we carry with us as Black women around what our hair means to us and how the texture of our hair, the length of our hair shapes and impacts our identities, our sense of self, our sense of beauty, really. Because for women, beauty is a feature, an ideal that is always imposed. And hair is a major aspect of beauty standards. And as we know, European hair is the highest degree of beautiful hair, feminized hair that's held up in American culture and, quite frankly, worldwide. So the chapter looks at how it is that Black enslaved women treated their hair amid captivity, amid enslavement, in circumstances in which they could not have cared for their hair the way they would have in West Africa or Central Africa. They didn't have those implements and tools. They didn't have those salves and balms. They didn't have the time to put elaborate braids into their hair as they would have in their previous lives or in their ancestors' lives. Yet, they did make an effort to beautify themselves through how it was that they dressed their hair and treated their hair. And here I relied quite a bit on the work of Stephanie Camp, a historian whose work on Black women in slavery is just marvelous and who we all miss. But I rely on the deep dive that she took looking at Black women's discussions of how they used natural elements to do their hair, how they braided their hair, how they twisted their hair, how they used fabric to protect their hair during those heat-filled, humid, labor-intensive work days, and how they would, on Sundays, if they had Sundays off, or on the evenings, on the weekends, if they could slip away into the woods and join their community, how they would style their hair, how they would take out whatever they had used to keep their hair, curled up and rolled and tight and braided, and how they would flash those beautiful pieces of fabric they had, and just express a sense of creativity, artistry, self-love, beauty, kind of a sense of showing out to their community. They managed this despite the ugliness of their circumstances. And to me, this is one of the major ways that we can read the braid that Rose gave to Ashley. We can read it as Rose indicating to Ashley that despite their circumstances, Rose, Ashley, enslaved Black women, enslaved Black girls could love themselves. They could care for themselves. They could make the time, steal the time back to braid their hair, to adorn themselves. That was a really important aspect of it for me. And I think I spend most of the pages discussing that. I also talk about how DNA is carried through hair. And here I refer to and rely on the work of an artist that we both also know, Sonia Clark, who is a textile and fiber artist who loves to work with hair. She works with actual strands of hair and lots of hair to create all kinds of artistic pieces. Right now today, in an interview with her, she talked about how hair carries DNA, and that's partly why she loves it as a material for her art. And I talk in the book about the meaning of hair being a connector across family lines. That even though Rose and Ashley were going to be separated, Ashley having Rose's hair meant that Ashley had a literal piece of her mother's body. She would have her mother with her, and she would also have a representation of that lineage going back through the generations.
It's it's stunning, I think, to appreciate, right, all, right, that the hair, I think that there are perceptions of hair in the 19th century, as sort of sentimental, or, as in the hair in a locket, or ornamental, the mourning jewelry, right, in the mid 19th century that women wore. But I think you touch on something that I certainly know, when you realize your mother has kept a lock of your hair, your baby hair, right? Maybe your first haircut somewhere in a drawer. And what she's leaving you is something much more profound than some public presentation. I think that the intimacy, I guess, of it is really arresting for me.
Martha,
yeah.
I sense you're going to take us somewhere else and probably toward a close, but I can't resist once again asking you about your own work. So if I can take just a moment, I want to say that you mentioned this earlier, that the items that are inscribed on Ashley's sack are no longer with the sack. We don't know where they are. I ask myself probably too often, where is Rose's hair? Where is that braid? And I think about the hair that I've come across in the archives, which this happened to me twice, where I came across a lock of hair, and they were both locks of white abolitionists, Laura Smith Haviland at the Bentley Library, University of Michigan, and also Sarah Grimke at the Edelstone Library, at the College of Charleston. And coming across these locks of hair was impactful. It absolutely was impactful. Seeing these remnants of these women's bodies in a folder in an archive. But the absence of Rose's hair, I feel is meaningful, especially in contrast with coming across these white abolitionist women's hair when I wasn't even looking for them. Mm-hmm. But you sent me a message, it was just a personal message about some hair that you came across from your family, which to me feels very important in this conversation around absence and presence and Black women and the artifacts and the things they passed down. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that story with me and with us, Martha?
I will just very briefly, because I know we're anxious to get to the questions for you. But it is true that I think a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, I texted you an image of a lock of hair that I came across in, of all places, the Peabody Museum at Harvard.
The Peabody.
You didn't know that part. Okay. So let me catch folks up just briefly and say, I'm working on a family history, and my own grandmother was the subject of study by an anthropologist in the early 20th century, an anthropologist who was Black woman anthropologist, Carolyn Bond Day, who was investigating the meaning, the consequences, how we should understand people who were so-called mixed race. And Bondi was a physical anthropologist, so she measured skulls, she measured blood quantum, and she took hair samples. And there in the Peabody, I met with an osteologist who allowed me to examine a lock of my grandmother's hair. And the only thing I'll say about it is that it is such a twist on the story you've told about Rose and Ashley, because of course, the osteologist is the person who is charged with managing human remains, and the connotation is one, it's not a connotation, right? The significance of that phrasing is that this is hair that was collected not by a loving mother who clipped her braid as a keepsake and more for her daughter, but a social scientist who clipped the hair and put it forever, I don't know, in the custody of Harvard University and the Peabody Museum. And it connects, of course, to work we can't talk about today, which is the profound controversies and struggles over human remains more generally as they are kept in museums and archives. And I came to learn, right, the hair today is kept along with the bones and the teeth and other human remains that have not been repatriated. And another time we'll talk about how Native history and African-American history don't line up very neatly in this regard, because there's no self-consciousness about, on the museum's part, at least to this point, about holding on to my grandmother's hair or the hair of the scores of other Black folks whose hair they collected a long time ago.
Martha, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know the hair was at the Peabody. I think, so this is a conversation for another day in another context, but I think that is changing. What you said about the consciousness of the museum, even though what you pointed to about the divergence in the treatment of remains is real. I will say this for me is such a surprise in terms of the linkage between what you said about your grandmother's hair and Carolyn Bonday, because in all that she carried, there is an image of one of Carolyn Bonday's kind of study boards where she was looking at mixed race families, where she was collecting hair. And in her thesis, she writes about how important hair is to family, which was one of those little ideas that helped to spark my thinking about hair and lineage. Though Carolyn Bonday was, as you talked about, she was writing about mixed race African Americans in a way that I would suspect you and I would have some critical questions about. And she thought that hair was a signifier of this kind of higher lineage, but she still did point to how hair can carry across family and across time in a way that I found to be very interesting and helpful.
You have done so many things with this book, but I think one of the things that you've done is help to expand and open our eyes and to expand our appreciation and to slow us down when we encounter all kinds of material objects, whether it is the lock of hair or it is the sack, the quilt, the handkerchief, and more. You've gently instructed us to slow down and to contemplate those things and to ask about how they embody and how they carry meaning across time, across generations, into our own time. So I'm very grateful to you for this book and for this conversation. And I think at this point, I get to welcome Lorianne back from the National Women's History Museum. And I think Lorianne is going to help make sure that we get to some of the questions that folks have posted. So, but thank you again, Tiya. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Martha. Likewise.
Thank you both for that really revealing conversation. I realized I should not have worn mascara. I didn't realize how touched I would become during your conversation, but thank you for it. It was such a gift, such a blessing. So thank you. There are a handful of questions that I would love to get to from our audience members. And just first off, there's a question from audience member Christine, who is asking about the location of the sack now. Could you talk about that?
Sure. And I'm so glad that the question has been asked, because the sack is hard to track. I mean, it has been in motion for many years now. I hope that you all will give me a little bit of room for this response, because I think that the history is so interesting. The sack was separated from the family at some point in the early 20th century. We don't even really know when. There's no documentation of that, but it ended up at a flea market in Tennessee, where a flea market shopper purchased it in 2007. And this was a person who used to go to garage sales and secondhand shops and flea markets looking for things that she could repurpose and sell on eBay to try to help supplement the funding of her children's education. She found the sack in a bin of rags. She flipped it over. She read the inscription and she thought, there is something here. She bundled it back up in that bin of rags, took it to the dealer in the hopes that the person would not notice what a treasure there was in that bin. And she paid $20 for the whole thing. She then donated the sack to the Middleton Place Foundation, which is the entity that owns and operates the Middleton Place Plantation in Charleston. So that foundation is the legal owner of the sack. The plantation had displayed the sack, and they sent it to New York for a short-term exhibit, and then they lent it to the Smithsonian. So when it was on view at the Smithsonian, when that museum opened, it was on loan. And very recently, just, my goodness, let's see, it's March, right? So a year ago, March, the Middleton Place Foundation decided they were going to bring the sack back to Charleston. So it's back in their collections. They displayed it in February of this year in honor of Black History Month. And they say that they are next going to loan it to the new International African American History Museum, which is opening up in Charleston. So the next place people will likely be able to see it will be in the Charleston African American Museum.
Well, thank you for that. And Sonia asks, were there other writers, historical figures, or creatives that informed your crafting of the book?
I turned quite a lot to creative writers in thinking about this book. I turned to Black women novelists, Gail Jones, Toni Morrison come immediately to mind, Alice Walker. I turned to poets, past and present. Nicole Seeley comes to mind. I have a line from her poetry in the book about love, actually. And what these works allowed me to do was to think about that submerged emotional space that Martha alluded to earlier in our conversation, that space that we as scholars know that we can't actually get to because our sources don't allow us in there, but it's a space that we as human beings, which includes scholars sometimes, right? It's a space that we as human beings really need to gain access to because it helps us to understand people of the past, to have more empathy and to understand ourselves. And so for me, creative writing is the best kind of writing that helps us move into the human interior. And I drew on that. I did, in an earlier version of the manuscript, include some fictionalized segments, which I'm sure was inspired by that reading. And it was motivated by my hope that I could capture something of that inner emotional experience. But I ended up taking those out. And it was actually me and not my editor who said, take those out. I felt that for the time I had written those sections, I had come closer to that inner space, and that I could then kind of pull back and maintain the feeling or the mood without needing to rely so much on the fictionalization, which I, in the end, felt much happier with because I was already working with so few sources, and I really wanted to be able to make the case that this is a history. These are real lives. This happened. And so I didn't want in the end to push a fictionalization of these women's histories too far in the book.
I think you really resonate with a lot of the historians who are on the call today. who were talking about feeling affirmed by your struggles with writing the book and really getting the process going. And one attendee has asked, how can we start writing? She says, I have also struggled, or maybe it's a he. This person says, I have also struggled to write a book due to anxiety of speaking our truth. I have been trying to speak with my mom's side of the family, who are Black, African American, and have been avoiding talking with my dad, who's Nigerian. I do not know where to begin the healing process. I feel the sack on my back.
I just so appreciate the sharing of that conundrum and the dilemma that the questioner is in. Because one thing that actually is a bit of a protective shield for me in all that she carried is that it's not about my family. Now, there are ethical questions that must be raised about that, right? About writing about someone else's family. But it's not my family, which means that I didn't have that particular kind of responsibility and burden of working through with my family what could or could not be said and how it might or might not be said. That is a whole other, very, very thick layer of the kind of work that must come with family history and personal memoir that I did not have to contend with. I am aware of people who have decided to actually wait until certain members of their family have passed on to the other side before writing their family histories, because of that burden and responsibility that we're talking about. And perhaps sometimes that's, that's a road that people need to follow and a way to manage some of the risk. Because I do think that we, as scholars, as writers, as curators, as people who work in public history, who work in public domains, that we bear the responsibility of realizing that although we are choosing a certain kind of exposure, our family might not be choosing that. And what does that mean about how we write? So to the question of where does one start or how does one start, I do think that one does have to wrestle with these ethical questions and that the answers will be personal to that individual, to each of us. But I also think that there's certainly no harm done, and quite the opposite. I mean, I think that a positive good can come from our going ahead and putting the words to the page. This is where I am a huge proponent and fan of journaling. I have written a number of just kind of loose leaf notebook pages about Rose, Ashley, and Ruth, and my own grandmother, just as a way to kind of allow myself to express things, to begin to think through things that maybe won't ever end up, in my in a manuscript or on my computer screen, but that is actually beginning a process of writing for me, and also beginning a process of maybe just expression of catharsis for me. So I want to acknowledge this difficulty. It is real. And I also want to encourage going ahead and taking the step to begin writing the things down, even if it's just a private jotting, a private set of pages that you're going to tuck away in a drawer for a few years.
Martha, is there anything you would add to that? Because I suspect you've also kind of tangoed with that same question.
I'll say just two things. I want to underscore what Tiya said about writing down, getting down, that in some of my earlier work, one of my regrets was that I didn't interview my elders, right? I didn't ask the questions. I didn't write those things down. And so I think sometimes there is a timeliness, at least to the collecting of those stories and the building up of our stories that sometimes can't wait, even if we don't know quite what we're going to do with them. And I can say in my work, that it's great to find a family ally. I have a distant cousin who's a genealogist and who shares my fascination with all that I find, all that she finds, that is a real source of kind of companionship. And I have a brother who is generously non-judgmental, and some days it might be only them who have an enthusiasm or an appetite, or share my sense of how and why we tell the stories that we tell. But I also share empathy for the question and for the questioner, because I have also, family members who would prefer you leave the past in the past. And I understand that too.
Lorianne, I would like to bring in some thoughts that are appearing in the chat about this, because we have some family historians who are talking about their own process. Dara Williams, I hope that was the correct pronunciation, and Christina Morris are talking about the importance of listening as family historians, and of sometimes holding yourself back when you want to ask the next question, when instead the best thing to do is to just listen and sit with the voices of your family members. This resonates with what Martha said. I mean, I can just imagine that cousin and your brother listening to you. You described that kind of process and how important that is for you. This also resonates for the story of Rose and Ashley and Ruth, because Ruth sews onto the sack that Ashley is my grandmother. And this is a line that I love because it's kind of staking a claim, a relational claim, a kinship claim, a love claim to Ashley, with Ashley. And it's also conjuring up this sense that Ashley was the storyteller for Ruth, that Ruth listened. We have the story because Ruth listened to Ashley. She listened to Ashley, and she, in a sense, wrote the story down by sewing it onto the sack. So I want to thank everybody for writing these thoughts in the chat, and encourage everyone who's thinking about these questions to read the chat and see the insights that are being shared there.
Just a couple more questions. Mason asks, was there someone who inspired you to write about history?
You already know the answer, you all. You know the answer. I feel like all roads lead to my grandmother, Alice Eileen Banks, because she was an incredible storyteller. She was just so funny. She was hilarious, just hilarious. The words she would choose, the color that she would put to her stories, the way she would capture a character or a personality. And when I was little, I spent a lot of time with her because my mom and I lived with my grandparents for a while. And I just spent time with her going through her day. These are just my best memories, you all. Going through her day, picking the greens in the garden, cleaning the greens or snapping the beans, or, cleaning the house, or watching some of her favorite TV shows, and eating those those peanuts, those orange candy peanuts. I don't know what those are called, but she loved those. So we would just eat those, and she would just tell
Circus
stories.
peanuts.
Yes, she loved those. And she would, eat those and tell stories about growing up in Mississippi, which were her favorite stories to tell, about her family, about their home, about their cows, and about her grandmother's, about her mother's cooking, my great-grandmother's cooking. There are some sad stories that she would tell about Mississippi too, intermixed with the stories of love and family. And she told stories about coming north on the train, and told stories about trying to make it in Cincinnati with her kids. And at the time, I did not know these stories were history. In fact, I would have said they were not history. I actually had a strong dislike for history through high school and through much of college, because history wasn't anything that I thought I cared about or that anybody I knew, really did. It was when I realized that my grandmother's stories were a part of history. And when I realized that, because I had written what she said down at some point, and even recorded her at some point that I was acting as an oral historian, that the light bulb went off. And so she's the person who inspired me.
For that again. And then there's a last question, bit of a doozy, but I would love to have you lend your thoughts to this. How can we move forward with generational trauma? We have been dealt so many things to carry. So I can still vividly hear Erykah Badu's Bag Lady from 1997 to 2000-ish.
This is the question. I mean, this is really the question, and this is the argument behind all that she carried and behind the meaning of the sack, in my view. And so this is a perfect last question, Lorraine, and I'm so grateful to the person for asking it. This is what we need to know, because we do emerge from histories of trauma that is carried across generations and passed through generations of families and communities and countries and of a global community. Of course, you know that I don't have an answer to that, but when I don't have an answer, what I try to do is to turn to people who have experienced that thing and who have reflected on that thing. And one of those people is Ruth Middleton. Black women of the past are those people. Our ancestors are those people. Some of us are those very individuals. And what the sack tells me, what the meditation on this particular set of Black women's stories tells me, is that we persevere through trauma that travels across time by grasping love and holding on to the people we care about and who care about us with as much strength and grace and perseverance as we can. That's all I know that we can do. That's all I know that we have. But I think that it is very powerful. And if it were not very powerful, none of us would be here.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. Thank you for those words of wisdom. Thank you to you both, Martha and Tiya, for being here for this very candid conversation. It's just really been a blessing, I think, to all of us who had the opportunity to listen in. I will close the program there with just some final remarks. Robin, no worries. I see your oh no, my screen froze. This is being recorded. It will be available on the museum's dedicated YouTube channel later this week. And if you did enjoy this Sundays at Home presentation, then we encourage you to join us again on Wednesday, March 30th, as we conclude our Women's History Month celebration of women's lives and impact with NWHM Presents, a virtual conversation with local DC author Joanne Hill and a tour of her own, Caitlin Caligera, in discussion about Washington, DC's hidden sites of women's history at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. They would like to encourage you to continue seeking out women's history and uncovering those stories. For a full listing of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. And thank you again to Tiya and Martha. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And thank you to our generous sponsor, Time Warner Media, and our co-presenter for this month's programming, DC Public Library. Until next time we meet, please stay safe and healthy. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.